start. So I'm Andrea Whitcomb, the Associate Dean Research for the Faculty of Arts and Education here at Deakin University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the continuation of a series that we started last year around climate change and what we might be able to do about it. The series is really intentionally designed to have a conversation across both research and professional staff, so academic and professional. And we want to really stage these conversations so that we know not only more about the state of affairs, but also that we can begin to think about what we might be able to do within the faculty as a basis for change across the university sector as well, in the way we think about our contribution to the debate and hopefully to improving the situation. So before we start with what is the first paper in this year's series, could I please acknowledge that we are, of course, standing on Indigenous country that has never been ceded, and to acknowledge Indigenous elders past, present, and future, wherever we might be today, knowing that within Deakin, certainly we are across Melbourne, Geelong, Warrnambool, and that today we also have a presenter from QUT. So no doubt we've also got Brisbane in the room with us today as well. So welcome, Marcus. Thank you for joining us. The paper today is from our criminologists in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences with their colleague, Professor Marcus Foth from QUT, and it is titled A Post-Capitalocentric Critique of Digital Technology and Environmental Harm, New Directions at the Intersection of Digital and Green Criminology. So I put you in their safe and capable hands. Thank you very much. Laura, I'm assuming you're kicking off.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. And hello, everyone. So welcome to this first Thinking with Climate Change seminar for 2021. We're very excited to be here, and we're hoping to set the bar quite high. I'm Laura Bedford. I'm one of the three speakers that'll be sharing the podium, or whatever we want to call it, the desk in our homes today. Like Andrea, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people and the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land from which I and Dr. Monique Mann are respectively presenting today. And on behalf of Professor Marcus Foth, I'd also like to acknowledge the people of the Turrbal and Yagara as the first owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. We also recognise the past atrocities against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this land, and that Australia was founded on the genocide and dispossession of First Nations people. We pay our respects to these peoples and thank them for allowing us to have our gathering on their land, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and future. Of course, I'd also like to thank Andrea and the Faculty of Arts for inviting us to present today in this exciting series. So the discussion today is effectively based on a paper that we co-wrote for a special issue called Beyond Cybercrime, which is currently under review at the International Journal for Crime, Justice and Social Democracy, and which is being co-edited by our criminology colleague, Dr. Mark Wood. I expect that this presentation will go for about 30 minutes, and that will leave some time for questions and discussions. So having done the intros and acknowledgements, I will, without further ado, hand over to Dr. Monique Mann to get us started.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. And I'm also driving the slides. So in our research of the paper that Laura just mentioned, we employ a post-capitalocentric approach to critique the societal and economic framework that the extractivism, design, manufacturing, use, and disposal of digital technologies are embedded in. And our argument proceeds as follows. First, I will discuss digital technology and the field of digital criminology, and then Laura be discussing the extraction of minerals for green technology specifically, the green technology revolution, and the case study of deep sea mining. I will then I'll come back and talk about the transference, transport and disposal of e-waste and associated societal and environmental harms, and then also discuss how planned obsolescence and denying the right to repair fuels consumption, which is good for profit and economic growth, but promotes ongoing extractivism and waste. And then we'll hand over to Marcus in terms of his discussion around decoupling technological progress and economic growth through an examination of more than human futures and design thinking. So that's the outline of our talk today. Our presentation will highlight some new perspectives on harm and in particular a focus of green technologies. It's interesting and I think important to situate this within criminology as a discipline and also digital criminology is somewhat of a sub-discipline for us. And the discipline is very much focused on cybercrime, hence the kind of special issue being titled Beyond Cybercrime, which is basically the use of computers and the internet to commit crimes such as fraud, for example. More recently, the field has been focused on human rights issues in relation to surveillance in particular. But there have been really limited attempts to think about digital technology in other ways, and that's what we're trying to do with this work. There have been some recent attempts to reposition and widen the discipline's focus to reconsider a range or a broader kind of range of harms that technologies posed, including environmental harms of technology, but within the subfield or sub-discipline of green criminology. And so Rob White in this work, he kind of approaches this through three lenses, which we may apply to digital and green criminology, or the intersection of them. And that's technology as a tool in preventing and responding to ecological harms, technology as the problem or solution to ecocide, so this technological solutionist approach, particularly through green technologies, and also technology as being paradoxical in terms of its contradictory impacts. So the later two aspects, technology as problem and solution, and also its paradoxes, are of greatest interest here to us. And we use this to ground our discussion of the environmentally devastating impacts of green technologies in particular, as they are currently being developed within the global capitalist economy. So technology, we know, can create or reinforce some harms while aiming to reduce or address other harms. So for example, fluorescent light globes is an example of this. They minimize energy consumption, but they contain mercury. Green criminologist R.V. Brisbane and Nigel South highlight some of the harms in terms of another example that hybrid or electric vehicles have, and also in doing so draw attention to the criminogenic significance of consumption. And they show how championing new environmentally beneficial devices and systems under sort of this greenwashed approach, greenwashed marketing and so forth, really fuels and perpetuates the consumption of rare earth minerals that stimulates more demand and more extraction. And so these forms of paradoxical harms are really distinct from unintended consequences. And as we will show throughout our presentation today, they're neither accidental nor incidental, but instead purposive and systemic. So Zena critiques global investments, in particular green energy, such as wind and solar, which often ignore the hidden carbon footprint in their production, shipment and life cycle. So in this way, the green energy agenda reframes what is a planetary consumption crisis to a problem of inadequate innovation in our energy production systems. So we want to draw attention to these critiques because they seed doubt in the idea that technological innovation and making more consumption more efficient will address the environmental crises that we're currently facing. So instead, what we argue in this paper is that the benefits of the green and energy revolution will be unequally distributed around the globe, with the harms associated with it will be more severe in the economic global periphery, and we'll speak to this throughout the talk. So these paradoxical harms of technology also highlight this unequal global distribution and demand of technology production and use, where the harms of these techno fixes to the environmental crisis are externalized to the global economic periphery. And this, we think, or we contend, really shows the importance of adopting or critiquing or thinking about the political ecology of technologies to understand their role in the perpetuation of uneven relationships of power and conflict, and historicize this in terms of their contribution to environmental harms. So I'll hand over now to Laura.
Thanks, Monique. So building on this idea of political ecology of technology, our paper emphasizes how the benefits and burdens of extractivism, consumption and waste are unevenly distributed around the planet, driven by what we're emphasizing is a process of ecologically unequal exchange, which characterizes the global capitalist system, and which Hornborg and Martinez-Alia, for example, argue is the underlying source of most of the environmental distribution conflicts in our time, obscured by this apparent reciprocity of market prices. Through our paper, we also emphasize that in the face of increasing resistance by local communities at the commodity frontiers, extractivism is associated with enclosure of wild spaces outside of formal regulation, or indeed informal mobilizations of environmental defense of these wild spaces. Serious allegations of environmental despoliation and social harm in the periphery of the global economic system are increasingly highlighted in the literature, but these continue to be shrugged off by mining companies and put down to localized corruption and a lack of regulatory oversight. But in the host countries and regions in the global economic periphery subject to extractivism, a lack of regulatory oversight cannot be understood separately from the implications of enhancing what Monique was talking about, this efficiency of global supply chains and making more consumption more efficient. And indeed, the externalization of the impacts of economic growth in the economic core. New slide. One wide space undergoing economic enclosure by multinational corporations is the deep ocean. And to illustrate, I'm going to briefly discuss the mining of the deep ocean floor for polymetallic nodules. Now, we know that minerals and metals such as cobalt, copper, and nickel are designed and manufactured into green energy technologies, such as energy-efficient smart thermostats, wind turbines, lithium-ion batteries that store green energy, and they're a component in the wiring and cabling that undergirds basically every single electronic device you can think of. As we move away from fossil fuels and as demand for these devices increases, so does the demand for these minerals and metals. Specifically, due to its use in electric vehicles and batteries that store green energy, cobalt is often put forward as a critical mineral, the lead mineral in the green energy revolution. One Swiss-based multinational mining company, Glencore, accounts for more than a quarter of the world's land-based cobalt output as a byproduct of copper mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's not going to be my purpose here to embellish on the social and environmental harms of these mining operations in the Congo. I'm sure most of you are aware of them and this concept of blood minerals. But with an anticipated 460% increase in global cobalt demand projected by 2050, that's by the World Bank, and with more than half of the global land supply of cobalt mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and half refined in China, it's very easy to begin to see how the incredibly lucrative global supply chain is highly vulnerable to community-led or indeed geopolitical disruption. So alternative sources of cobalt are now being actively sought. New slide. One as yet unmined source of cobalt and other metals and minerals is in the hydrothermal vents, the seamounts along the mid-ocean ridges, and the abyssal plains of the deep ocean seabed. And here we're talking down to 6 kilometers deep below the ocean surface. As we can see on the slide here, international waters cover more than half of the global seafloor. And the deep ocean contains more valuable minerals than all continents combined. So this is a rich source of future metals and minerals. New slide. Within the broader global push for seabed mining to fuel the green technology revolution, the rush to exploitation is being accelerated in the Pacific region through a small number of venture capitalist-led mining companies and small Pacific Island nations, supported by the United Nations International Seabed Authority. The International Seabed Authority is purportedly an autonomous intergovernmental body that considers and approves applications for exploration of deep sea resources in what is known as the area, which is the vast seabed and high seas water columns outside of national waters and exclusive economic zones. It must be stressed that the role of the ISA is not to prevent mining in the area, but indeed to enable it and identify locations where mining will be permitted by state-sponsored companies. However, within the exploration contracts that the ISA doles out to these companies, sponsored by their little local nations, it's up to the companies granted exploration licenses to monitor and report on their own environmental impacts. And sponsoring states are expected to monitor and enforce the activities undertaken by mining companies. With a tiny annual budget of 10 million per annum for the entire area, it's fairly patent that neither the ISA nor the sponsoring countries, such as Nauru, are in a position to effectively monitor company operations. Scholars, scientists, and activists have raised alarm about the as yet unknown, and some have argued, in fact, unknowable, but likely severe environmental impacts to the health of the entire ocean of deep sea mining. And they've argued that the roles of the ISA are in direct conflict. They highlight its dual mandate of promoting the development of deep sea minerals, whilst ensuring that this development is not harmful to the environment. And I think we all know, sort of empirical examples abound, how well the story goes when the moral compass of mining companies is all that stands between their activities and the environment. New slide. One company that's at the forefront of opening up the seabed to extractivism is the Canadian-based multinational, beautifully named Deep Green, which holds exploration contracts sponsored by 3 small Pacific Island nations, Nauru, Kiribati, and Tonga. In line with its greenwashing, Deep Green does not refer to their proposals as mining, but instead Deep Green portrays itself as collecting, with such a gentle touch, the polymetallic nodules it's seeking to acquire. Unsurprisingly, Deep Green positions deep sea mining as essential to the green energy revolution and argues that the environmental and social impacts of deep sea extraction are significantly lower than land-based mining. It claims that its activities will allow for the global transition of fossil fuels at a fraction of the environmental and social costs associated with metal production from conventional land ores, such as we see in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. However, Deep Green's offtake agreement with the transnational extractivist mining company, Glencore, of Democratic Republic of Congo fame, and its recent partnering with the Swiss firm Allseas, that specializes in offshore oil and gas pipeline installation, calls their efforts to market a green social license to operate into serious question. Further, while private mining companies do not have participant status at the International Seabed Authority annual sessions, and they do not qualify for ISA observer status, it's alleged that Deep Green contractors routinely attend ISA meetings in Kingston, Jamaica, where the ISA is headquartered, including as members of their sponsoring state delegations. In a February 2019 session of the ISA Council, spokespersons for Deep Green allegedly addressed the meeting under their sponsoring state flag and were seated in the seat marked Nauru. Activists have highlighted the way, behind closed doors, the ISA Secretary General, the Nauru government have allowed Deep Green to use their positions in an attempt to influence international and Pacific regional law and policymaking to serve the company's interests. Concerns of these conflicts of interest and the impact of mining on the oceans have led to calls around the globe for the application of the precautionary principle and a moratorium on deep sea mining until impacts can be much, much better assessed. But despite these concerns, Deep Green, amongst others, is pushing ahead with moving from exploration to exploitation, supported by Nauru and the ISA. So apart from the performative PR and engagement theatre and greenwashing that we're all becoming quite familiar with, concerns might be raised in this case about the Faustian choices that are being offered by billionaire tech companies, who increasingly take on a messianic role with claims that their profit-driven production will save us from climate change through a green tech revolution. So I'm going to leave you with these images of deep green, Nauru, and the ISA bromance as we now turn to the transference and transport of e-waste, another step along the production line, and the end product of extractivism from the tech industry. So I think back over to you, Monique.
Yes, back over to me. So moving from Laura's kind of case study and thinking about these ideas around regulatory capture and so forth, in the paper, we also look at some of the regulatory frameworks in relation to e-waste and also planned obsolescence and the right to repair. So further to the extractivism that Laura outlined with the case study of seabed mining and deep green, you also have the end product. And these are designed to be disposable, which creates the issue of e-waste. So in 2019, human beings set yet another digital waste record, discarding 53.6 million metric tons of e-waste. And the regulatory structures around this and the e-waste conventions are not designed to prevent or stop the transference, transport and disposal of global harm through e-waste, but actually to facilitate it, which we think that's also quite problematic as well. To make matters worse, only 20% of e-waste is recycled, and the remainder forms what the United Nations Environment Assembly has termed a global crisis. The production of global solid waste has reached an all-time high, with over 2 billion tonnes discarded each year, much of it burned illegally, dumped at sea, or buried in unregulated landfill. It's estimated that about 50 million tonnes of e-waste is created each year, much of which is trafficked and transported to nations in the global economic periphery to deal with. And so another significant aspect that's fueling consumption is this idea of planned obsolescence. And this creates demand for more new products by design, to produce and consume more new products. And this continues to this perpetual cycle of the extraction of new raw materials and a steady stream of waste or e-waste. So there are 4 types of planned obsolescence: technological or functional, where a product becomes obsolete due to enhanced technology; style obsolescence, where products are designed and marketed in a way so that the consumer purchases a more fashionable or more up-to-date product; systemic obsolescence, where a wider system is altered so it's difficult to use or maintain services for a product. So for example, every time Apple puts out a new update to its operating systems, and then also product failure and breakdown. So forms of product failure breakdown are an explicit design strategy to shorten the lifespan of a product so that it becomes non-functional, and as a result, consumers purchase new replacement products, thus further contributing to extraction, production, consumption, and this is all required to fuel the growth of the global capitalist economy. So operating in tandem with approaches to planned obsolescence, we also have active attempts to deny the right to repair. And this is also very much supported by intellectual property frameworks, intellectual property legal frameworks that provide limited rights to repair for consumers to repair broken or non-functional products themselves or by third parties. So there have been some attempts to introduce or enforce right to repair laws, for example, in the United States, that would allow consumers to be able to repair products. However, their introduction has been delayed directly as a result of manufacturers lobbying, arguing that they contravene intellectual property rights. And in particular, Apple has been very active at doing this. And so all of this very much contributes to the mining of more rare minerals for new batteries or electronic components, more e-waste that's dumped rather than recycled, repaired or reused, and ultimately more environmental harm. And I just wanted to draw attention in particular to Apple, that runs very much greenwashed campaigns, and you can go on their website and look at their environmental credentials of Apple officially in the green. On one hand, you know, it's doing this, but it also designs and produces components for its products that are difficult to repair or replace. For example, batteries that are glued in, the use of proprietary screws that only Apple or authorized third parties can unscrew, and also very active attempts in lobbying against right to repair frameworks. And so at this point, I'm going to hand over now to Marcus Foth.
Thank you very much, Monique and Laura, and thank you, Andrea and Emily, for hosting this fantastic seminar. My section here is going to talk a little bit about our experience coming from a design research perspective. The paper that we've submitted is actually about finding new directions for research and identifying the kind of research agenda at that intersection of digital and green criminology. So I saw my contribution in this paper in a way as explaining and critiquing and summarizing, I suppose, a little bit what has been happening in the design field. And so a lot of the examples that we've seen so far are actually being propelled and accelerated by the kinds of work that we do in design. A lot of the products that we see are designed products, both digital and physical elements coming together. And so the design field and design community has actually started to grapple with our complicity in these kinds of atrocities. And this book that I've just put there as one example of many by now, by Mike Montero, Ruined by Design, How Designers Destroyed the World and What We Can Do to Fix It, is just one account of how we are starting to critically reflect on this kind of complicity. Monique, if you go to the next slide, please. One of the predominant kinds of contributions, scholarly contributions in the design research field is actually borrowing from a lot of work already done over a number of years in the environmental humanities. And the very popular theory in that regard is the more than human work. It started, at least from what I know, with a very seminal work by David Abram, The Spell of the Centuries. But next slide, please, Monique. This work has actually informed and fed into scholarly contributions over a number of years now. You can see this goes right through probably the last 2 decades, and I've highlighted a couple of those. It's not going to be possible to talk about all of these in detail, but we're very happy to share the slides if anyone is interested in following up on these references. Next slide. The one that I do want to highlight is this work by my colleague Laura Folano, who is a designer in Chicago and at the Illinois Institute of Technology in the design school there. My own work is in smart cities and the way technology gets used in cities. And I think a lot of the smart cities rhetoric is around sustainability. And it is actually very much an example of this kind of greenwashing that we've just been talking about. So Laura's work here is proposing how we actually in design need to decenter the human, which sounds very counterintuitive to designers, because for decades we've been practicing what's called human-centered design. And so her article that has been now cited in the hundreds, and it's growing exponentially, is proposing that we actually need to do the opposite. We need to decenter the human in the design of collaborative cities. Next slide. In our own work here at QUT, we've started to translate some of this. And in this example here, for instance, we've been looking at fairy light installations that are very popular in Brisbane, but I think in other Australian cities as well. It has a very common problematic of what we've just talked about in terms of these lights, the batteries and the installations, the tech installations that would make them possible. In this particular paper, we've actually started to look through such installations from a more than human lens and looked at what are the implications for media architecture, which is a subfield of design. And if you then look at it from a human perspective, you see that it's very convenient, it's very human-centered in the sense of sparking a nice experience, in this case, walking off the Goodwill Bridge onto the QUT campus. But if you look at it from a more than human perspective, if you, for instance, consider nocturnal animals, arboreal animals that live in those trees, their eyes are adjusted for nighttime vision, and they would actually be displaced by the installation of such fairy lights because they wouldn't be able to inhabit these trees anymore. Next slide. Another work has been looking at methods. We actually have a very well-established repertoire of participatory methods in design, and they need to change. They need to adjust and accommodate the more than human. And so in this workshop where we've been, this is in Belgium, in Genk, we've been doing an academic workshop where we've been assessing the city of Genk from a more than human perspective. And you can see me there with a mask of a honeybee, and others have taken other local more than human beings on as agents in order to do an assessment that actually juxtaposes human needs and tries to contrast that with the needs of the more than human. Next slide. Overall, though, the research agenda needs to scale up. So everything that I've been talking about at the moment is at the individual level of the designer, and that translates into the individual level of consumption and the individual user, because in design, we like to talk about usability and what is happening at that very local level. What we are doing in this particular piece is actually just try and scale this up at the level of the city, which then corroborates with issues of governance, of polity, and with further inputs from fields such as urban planning and political science. So this is a piece where we are starting to think about what the post-anthropocentric city would look like, and also how we need to have a much larger purview, more holistic perspective, because once we have these sustainability objectives in a smart city, what they actually are doing in effect is exporting the environmental harm out of sight, out of mind. So they, as we've just seen, they happen in the making of such products. They are further corroborated by the disposal of such products. But we then have KPIs that are only looking at sustainability within the city. And that is actually a fallacy that we need to rectify. Next slide. As part of this work, we've now started to create a research group here at QUT that is, I'm very happy to say, growing quite rapidly. We got, now that we started in our faculty, a lot of influx from colleagues in other schools and disciplines and from other faculties. And so it's very nice to see how this more than human and the post-capitalocentric or post-anthropocentric theories and scholarly work is actually transcending faculty boundaries, and it's bringing a lot of these silos down. And so we have contributions from people in science and education, in business even. And so it's great to see that this has been taking off. Next slide. This is just the final one before I hand over to Laura. My colleague, Professor Ron Vakari at Simon Fraser University in Canada, was so kind to share this manuscript with me, and it's coming out this year with MIT Press. It's an entire monograph on the things we could design for more than human-centered worlds. And it's just further evidence how these very critical appraisals are now starting to translate into much more actionable knowledge to not just critique what's wrong, but also finding new ways of what we can do about it. I'll hand over to Laura for some final words. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, so through this paper, we've seen how profits are maximized through every step of the supply chain of greenwash technology with really serious social and environmental consequences. And I think a lot of literature is now coming out on that, as Marcus has just been saying. And we're moving beyond actually recognizing the problem to starting to really try to find ways to address it. And I think we as academics need to move along with that process. We're still stuck in the kind of situation where we're still critiquing, but we actually don't know enough about what is actually happening on the face of the rock either. So we need to kind of approach this in a multi-pronged fashion. And we've also seen how we are increasingly presented with a Faustian choice between kind of less worse alternatives and these paradoxes that Monique started with, the paradoxes that sit at this intersection of technology and green criminology. And these paradoxes are framed within a capitalocentric future, which is led by tech billionaires and their companies, supported by the very regulatory processes which have purportedly been established to constrain their worst excesses, but which in fact enable them. So we might also begin to ask questions about the extent to which democratic processes in the economic core itself, more broadly, might begin to be held to ransom by these new emerging plutocrats as they replace the old, ushered in by the spectre of climate change and the need to move away from fossil fuels to mitigate the worst impacts of our technomass and the profligate political economy that we've become used to. And finally, we've seen how alternative thinking is required, which steps away from this future to a deeply democratic one, which requires a more than human approach to the way we design, trade, and play within our technologies and habitats as humans. And I think I'll leave it there. I hope there's some food for thought, and we've got some time for questions. So this has been fun. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Monique and Marcus. And thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, team. That was an absolutely amazing paper. I just kind of look at all this and think, well, you know, when are we going to design something that is friendly to the more than human while also addressing climate change? The problems just multiply, don't they? But on the other hand, we also need hope. So, and I think in raising that question at the end, Laura, about, well, what can we do to aid things along beyond critique is also really, really important. I'm kind of thinking there, you know, immediately I kind of framed this series as wanting to be as much about research as about what we do within universities. So straight away, the problem of e-waste. What does your paper mean for uses of technologies within universities and our leasing arrangements and our kind of practices of replacing technology every 3 years, which of course, we're probably the first ones to want a new computer, right? A new laptop, but here we are contributing to the problem. So wicked problems indeed. I'll open it up for questions. You might need to speak. I'll go to the participant list. So if you put your hand up, I might be able to see it and give you the floor. Do we have comments, questions at all? John, you're not on mute. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, actually, I'd like to sort of follow up on what you said and what way we finished up. I mean, if we're going to sort of, we're sort of locked in this Faustian bargain, as you pointed out, and that's absolutely correct. So what do you see as the way forward in making less bad choices? I mean, seabed mining is just such a bad idea that, you know, we really just need to get international cooperation and lobby to, you know, it's sort of like nuclear weapons or weapons that, you know, don't have any human control on, or whatever that's called. But I mean, there's kind of simple ones like that we can just oppose. But then we've got to say, well, actually, this is where we get our cobalt from or our rare earths from. Yes, it's going to cause some damage, but, you know, or this is the way. I mean, and yes, kind of it's going to be a little bit chipping away at things, but we probably should actually be saying these are ones that are less bad. And how do we sort of do that and do that in a kind of coordinated or a systematic way that starts to actually improve things?
I'm happy to take that, John. So one of the things when I was putting together this, and I mean this, what I've presented here about this case study is kind of just touching the surface of what is an incredibly interesting process of not regulatory capture, but actually the development of a regulatory regime which is absolutely 100% pro deep sea mining. So the United Nations is in on this. They want this to happen. The European Commission, it's one of their 5 big blue growth strategies is deep sea mining. It is a fait accompli. And one of the things that's happening is that what I'm seeing is that you have these tech billionaire companies, and there are actually very few that are well positioned to go down that deep and to mine that deep. It's very expensive to develop this technology. And they're actually able to hold to ransom the process, because without these minerals, which have been designed so fundamentally into the green revolution, the green technology, energy revolution, we are sitting with the option, with no other option at this point, apart from continuing with the fossil fuels that we know are leading to climate change. So there's that's what I'm talking about, this Faustian choice, but the issue isn't even about regulatory capture. It's actually about the design of the regulatory institutions have been to allow for this to become a fait accompli. And the decision making and the how our future is being determined is not inside the democratic nations of the global economic core. It is actually being determined now by companies that sit entirely outside of it, these tech billionaires who are driving the agenda. And I think we need to also be asking questions about the political and regulatory and political economy of all of these things. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It is a very vexed question and it's very complex, but it's certainly a good one.
If it's okay, I'll just also add to it in terms of the kind of points that I discussed, really addressing issues around things like planned obsolescence and also the transference of e-waste and trying to limit this. And again, we see these same processes of, regulation, not preventing or stopping or outlawing or criminalizing these things, but facilitating them. So for example, the Basel Convention around the control of trans-border or transboundary movements of hazardous e-waste and their disposal, that's the principal or primary international treaty that regulates the movement and shipment of hazardous waste between nations. But significantly, it doesn't ban shipments of toxic waste outright. And so I think thinking about, well, how can we actually address, or coming from my focus in terms of looking at regulatory frameworks and dimensions, things like this, or, enabling through law and right to repair, the ability for people to actually repair their products so that we don't have to just throw them out, and also kind of encouraging or, making recycling a focus as well. And I don't know, Marcus, if you wanted to add anything further.
I do have some comments, but I'm happy to wait for some of the other questions so we get through some more.
Okay, Emily, you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Andrea. And thanks to all the speakers for a terrific and troubling paper, troubling in a good way, although not for the world. But my question is really probably to Marcus around the rise of more than human thinking in smart city design, which you gave as a really generative kind of case study of where new thinking processes are coming in here and are needed. And I just wondered, what your reflections are on the role of collaborating with Indigenous knowledges in that, given there has been some critique of more than human thinking from Indigenous thinkers as, kind of not acknowledging that these traditions of thought actually are Western that we're usually talking about, and Indigenous knowledge systems have always incorporated more than human thinking. And also I was sort of thinking, about that in relation to, the point about where just, the reproduction of these technological kind of models as an answer to the cause. And similarly with, Western thinking, Western thinking has been, to put it simplistically, a problem here. So can we solve this problem with more Western thought?
Yeah, great. Now, thank you for that question, Emily. That's wonderful. I think the more than human literature and that scholarship definitely not only acknowledges indigenous epistemologies, but in fact recognizes, going back to that work by David Abrams, for instance, in 96, that this is nothing new. In fact, relational thinking, the way that ontologically indigenous peoples have thought of themselves as being connected to place, caring for country, notions of stewardship, all of those are not just compatible with more than human theories, but in fact, they largely are one and the same. But the one and the same is at the same time problematic, because if we are coming from a Western tradition, I think it is positive for us to critique that kind of more Enlightenment notion and the more recent, well, recent as in 70s, 80s onwards, neoliberal kind of economic framework and so forth. That kind of critique is positive. At the same time, we've got to be careful that we don't claim that we are inventing something new here. And I think the more than human literature isn't doing that. In our own work, for instance, just as a final example, I'm very lucky that we have some indigenous scholars and researchers in our group, and also more far, I'm working with Professor Mary Graham and discuss a lot of things with her. She's based at the University of Queensland and Indigenous elder from Helensvale at the Gold Coast, and so a lot of that work around, for instance, legal personhood of nature and Earth jurisprudence is very embedded in indigenous scholarship that Mary then leads, and I'm not trying to claim any of the kind of research contributions. What I see as my role really is to find ways for that to then be translated into more practical methods and applications in the design field. And so we kind of carve out our own boundaries, but at the same time, there is that collaboration, as you mentioned.
Well, terrific. Thank you, Marcus.
Kristen, you wanted to ask a question?
No, I just want to say a few things. Thanks, Andrea. I really found it a really quite a fascinating seminar on every front. Every speaker added something different, and yet it all converged to make a really strong point in a range of areas. And I just found it so refreshing, because a lot of what has been raised today are things that I've either researched or felt quite strongly about. And so I sort of feel it's a kind of a different stage of the critique, and one that sort of opens up new ground and new territory. So I really do want to thank the researchers who've been behind this and your collaboration, which I think has been really, really strong and wonderful. So thank you. The only thing I wanted to add was this idea of market-based solutions being pushed towards climate change problems, and adding that that in itself is, in my view, very strongly related to climate change denial. And instead of taking climate change denial at face value, I've been interested in the work of a US economist, Philip Morawski, who has been quite strong, has put the view that climate change denial is simply a delay tactic to really push people away from solutions like demand reduction, which of course is the most obvious way to reduce CO2 emissions, and push people towards those market-based solutions. So if you think of climate change denial as a kind of mechanism, my research area is in public relations and what's going on in that sphere, and I did see a number of references to that over the course of the presentation. So I think there's a really strong link there between what's happening in that space and climate change denial as a delay tactic in order to enable this market-based solution to come in like a white charger after we've stuffed everything up. So anyway, that was the only thing I wanted to add. Thank you.
Would anybody like to respond to that? It seems to me very valuable addition. Another plank for you to look at, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think understanding those linkages, I mean, that's not what really where we went in this paper, but that is going to be really important to understand that in fact the denialism is part of a purposive process of allowing this sort of transfer from one group of plutocrats to the next, in my view, you know, so that you've effectively got a kind of smooth transition of capital, which isn't going to be disrupted along the way. So even with things like Allseas, which is one of the biggest oil and gas pipeline shipping companies, they're being brought in at the forefront of the deep sea mining, so that they will be able to, they're given what, you know, the pivot to move away from that. So it's about also keeping capital smoothly and beautifully centralized, and allowing for that transition. And so there's a huge amount of support for denialism that sits within these large operators in the mining and extractivism field, certainly. So that's a very good point.
It's more and more complex, doesn't it? Llewellyn Wishart also had a question for you. Llewellyn?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This has just been wonderful, hugely troubling and provocative. I guess I'm just curious to know, because it seems to me sometimes that the discourse or the debate tends to kind of latch onto to systems and structure, and I sort of wonder what the researchers, all of you, are thinking about the larger, and you've touched on it, about the larger questions around, you know, the solution really is, as was said before, about demand and consumptive reduction, which really is the inevitability of energy descent. And to me, it's not just questions of a political and structural and legalistic nature, but also about culture. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, about what cultural shifts that need to occur for people to be able to put their arms around the notion of the inevitability, perhaps, of energy descent, and that it's not actually going to be these green tech solutions, as much as many of us we've been acculturated to want or hope for that to happen, or we've been brainwashed. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
I got some quite simple views on this, which are that increasingly, I believe, politicians have a choice between two options. One is to face reality, and the other one is to point at the hope that tech solutionism seems to sell to the people in order to get re-elected. And so the majority of politicians opt for that latter option, where they point at solar panels and high-speed rail and whatever have you, as a way not to face the inevitable, as you said. But it all sounds like, well, maybe there's something, and it also shifts responsibility back onto scientists, engineers, to come up with much more, positivist approaches, as well as approaches that are driven by tech solutionism. So I think what we really need to recognize is that climate change has already been solved. Climate change is not actually a problem. Like, scientists would tell you what to do. It's just that we don't do it. And that's the problem with biodiversity, with rubbish, with everything. We know what to do. Everyone knows what to do. There's no interesting research papers published in Science whatsoever on these topics. The actual research that is interesting is, why aren't we, getting on with the job? And I think that is actually a problem for the entire HAS area of humanities, arts, and social sciences. It is a political problem. It is a cultural problem. It is not a problem of science and engineering. And yet we are still pointing the finger to that field in the hope that magically they will allow us to continue on the way that we've been living on this planet. And so, yeah, I find my collaborations with colleagues in humanities and social science far more fruitful than any of the collaborations I have with science and engineering, to be honest. There is obviously exceptions, because a lot of scientists themselves are very depressed about what's going on, because they publish all these research papers and, not a single politician reads them. It is probably the same with our papers in the humanities, but I think at the end of the day, we need to really recognize that climate change as a problem is a political and cultural problem.
Yeah, I think that's right, Marcus. Yeah, that's right. How we get there is the big unknown, isn't it? How we get that fixed. Okay, I think we're running towards the end. I'm just running down the list. I can't see any more hands up, but can I kind of join my colleagues in thanking you all for a wonderful, wonderful paper that has made us clearly think so much, recognize the enormity of the problem, but in some ways the simplicity of the solutions as well. Consume less. So I'm certainly going away with this with one simple thing for, what do I take away from this seminar in terms of faculty policy? Well, maybe a discussion around e-waste and what we do about it within the university would be as good a starting point as any, and certainly not to invest in cobalt or any of those minerals. But yeah, thank you very much for a fantastic opening to this year's discussions, and wonderful to see designers collaborating with criminologists and lawyers to kind of really get at the complexity of what is going on out there in the world around this greenwashing. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for
and thank you all for coming. Sorry, Monique.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.